In a world divided by race, one man shattered all barriers.
Jack Johnson rode.
Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight champion, faced hatred from whites with a smile.
First black champ, he faced the hate, smiled through it all.
His fearless spirit and flamboyant lifestyle inspired icons like Mike Tyson and Muhammad Ali.
Bold and brave, he changed the game. Inspired legends etched his name.
I don't put myself in the league of Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson's fighting in the ring, and there's 75,000 people saying, "I'm gonna kill you, nigga, if you hurt him."
And Jack Johnson, he's bad. He had to be a bad black man. Wasn't no black Muslims to defend him. He was by himself.
Witness the story of a Galvestonian giant.
The Galveston giant, Johnson is his name.
Jack Johnson, full name, Jack Arthur Johnson. He was born March 31st, 1878, in the city of Galveston, located on the Gulf of Mexico. Johnson was the third child of 9. His parents were former slaves. Slavery was abolished in 1865, but that didn't make it any easier for the black population of the United States. A large number of children were born not because children were happy, but to provide labor for the family. Despite the racism and segregation in the states in those years, Jack Johnson did not feel it as a child because he grew up mostly among whites. In those parts, people lived poor lives. They didn't care about figuring out relationships based on skin color. Everybody was in the same boat and survived as best they could. I grew up around white kids. I played with them. I slept at their houses, and their mothers gave me cookies. We ate at the same table. Nobody ever told me that white people were better than me, Johnson said. Jack's parents wanted their children to be educated, and Jack went to school, but he dropped out after 5th grade because he had to get a job on the docks. The meager pay forced him to go to Dallas. There, he first became acquainted with boxing. Johnson worked at the stables, and his friends often held friendly sparring among themselves. Jack liked boxing and began to repeat after his friends, trying to master the technique of striking. Johnson said that his desire to find a high-paying job and opportunities to take up boxing led him to New York. However, there are suspicions that staying in New York at the age of 15 years, is just a story of Jack himself. He was a master of storytelling, with almost 2,500 kilometers between the two cities. So it's hard to imagine that a black teenager with no money could travel a total of 5,000 kilometers at a time, when a black man could be shot or hung from the nearest tree simply for being black. But anyway, at the age of 16, Johnson returned to his native Galveston, where he learned that society was built on white supremacy. This discouraged him for a while, but then inside him, Jack felt the urge to break free from the shackles of Jim Crow law. Jim Crow law is the popular name for the Racial Segregation Act. The word segregation itself means separation. Whites go to white schools, blacks go to black schools. Whites sit in the front of public transportation. Blacks sit in the back. Whites get well-paying jobs. Blacks only get low-skilled jobs. Officially, the Jim Crow law was in effect from 1890 to 1964. But in reality, it came into being right after the abolition of slavery in 1965, so as not to traumatize the white population, who suddenly found out that black slaves were people just like them and had the same rights. So in fact, slavery in this form existed for another 100 years. Until 1967, there was a ban on mixed marriages. Until 1997, the U.S. Department of Agriculture denied loans to black farmers on the same terms as loans to white farmers. It wasn't just blacks who were disadvantaged in the States. Until 1943, there was a ban on Chinese entering the United States. Segregation against the Japanese increased at different periods. These are not all examples, but they are given to the fact that somehow, historically, in a state built on the principles of democracy, freedom, equality, and respect for human rights. It is hard to find a period when the country was not oppressed and disadvantaged. Naturally, one of the most difficult issues for the country in those years remains black issues. The foundation of these problems was built over several centuries, and to destroy it is an extremely difficult task. This is why states have social explosions that then have serious consequences, such as the 1967 Detroit riot, which was one of the catalysts for the collapse of the once richest city. The Los Angeles riot of 1992 caused billions of dollars in economic damage to the city and seriously damaged the image of the state. And of course, the world-famous riot of 2020, which also caused great economic damage. But back to the 19th century, Johnson's impulse to break out of his state of despair coincided with a very important acquaintance. After returning to Galveston, Jack began looking for work and came across an ad for a janitor. When he arrived at the address, he saw a boxing gym in front of him. The manager of the gym was German-born Hermann Bernau, a welterweight boxer. He worked hard, and after a while, he saved enough money to buy boxing gloves. From then on, Jack started sparring. It's a very different kind of sparring than it is now. At the end of the 19th century, there was no such ammunition as a helmet, and instead of a mouth guard, which appeared only in the 20s of the 20th century, used cotton cloth and resin. And no one spared each other in sparring. In these conditions, only the strongest really survived. By the age of 18, Jack Johnson was quite large for those years, the height of 1.84 meters, although the weight was about 165 pounds, but it was due to lack of nutrition. But even having acquaintances with professionals to start a boxing career for a black man was not so easy. And it is not even that professional boxing, despite the huge popularity in all states except Nevada, was outlawed. A negative role in the fact that it was difficult for blacks to start a career played this man, John Lawrence Sullivan, the first super heavyweight champion of the world. In the late 1880s, the straightforward, at times gruff but very charismatic Sullivan gained just crazy popularity. His portraits hung in bars all over the country. He was the most famous sportsman in the United States. Thanks to Sullivan, the title of the strongest boxer in the heavyweight division became a huge weight. Sullivan once said, "I've never fought a Negro, and I never will." And the problem was not Sullivan himself, but the society in which he grew up. Now, after such a phrase, boxer's career would be over once and for all. But in those days, such statements added credibility. And so when such trends in a racist society is set by a popular athlete, it has a great impact on the state of affairs. Very few famous boxers agreed to bouts with blacks. Therefore, it was not so easy for a black boxer to find a person who could organize decent fights for him. Even to just start a boxing career, black boxers had to go through the millstones of one of the most humiliating and brutal breeds of Jim Crow times. It was called a battle royal. The fighters, most often teenagers, 5 to 10 of them were herded into the ring, gloves on, and a command was given. If this pile of malas doesn't sound very humane to you, here's another detail. In most cases, the fighters were blindfolded. Just imagine, 10 people in the ring, blindfolded, trying to beat each other to the point where the one who fell down could not get up. There was a referee in the ring, sometimes even several people, but most often they did not interfere. If fighters hit each other on the back of the head, or below the waist, simply if you try to separate fighters who are blindfolded, there's a big chance that the referee will be mistaken for an opponent with all the consequences that follow. This event, whose spectators were a wealthy white audience, ended at the moment when all but one fighter was on the floor. He was declared the winner. The winner's reward was the change thrown by the rich at the end of the meat grinder. Based on articles and referee testimony, Johnson was involved at least twice, once blindfolded and once unblindfolded. Unofficially, there could have been dozens of such fights on his record. Here's what referee George Siller, who worked such fights, recalls. The fighters fought without blindfold. 6 black men entered the ring. Johnson entered last. As soon as the start was given, Jack immediately cut down the first opponent. He flew back like he'd been shot out of a cannon. After that, 2 rivals rushed toward him. But Jack broke the distance. They did not even have time to realize what happened. But then, he sharply approached and knocked out both of them. There were still 2 opponents left. But when they saw this, they lay down on the decking and crawled out of the ring. Siller was one of the most respected referees of those years. He started telling his colleagues and friends about the Black Giant, who demolished his opponents, and some of them literally crawled out of the ring with their tails tucked. That eventually became Johnson's nickname, the Galveston Giant. The Battle Royal often served as a kind of undercard before the main fights, so managers and promoters, and in those days, these positions were often combined, and they followed the performances of black fighters. After one of these fights, Johnson was noticed by promoter P.J. Carroll, who arranged for Jack to fight another black giant named Klondine Haynes. Johnson lost the first fight. The second fight was a draw, and he won the third fight. One thing to note in this regard is why some promoters did pay attention to blacks. Because if you raise a black fighter and then at the right time to throw him under a white one, you can make good money on it. Because the public will always pay well to see the superiority of the white race. However, promoters did not go too far, so black boxers were not even close to the fights with reputable white fighters. Officially, Jack Johnson had his first professional fight on November 1st, 1897, at the age of 19, although there is evidence that he had fought a year earlier. If you look at the results of the first fights, it does not look promising, but it should be understood that during this period, Johnson was not a boxer as such. Yes, he sparred and held fights, but if there was success, it was only due to physical data. But no one taught him boxing. No one explained the basics. No one offered him to look at boxing through the prism of how the sport was seen. For example, Pierce Egan. And there came a moment in Jack Johnson's life when he too met a man who instilled in him the technical and tactical fundamentals of professional boxing. The circumstances of this meeting and the development of the relationship is a unique story that simply has no analogs. In February 1901, a boxer named Joe Chinsky, a future member of the Boxing Hall of Fame, as well as the Jewish Sports Hall of Fame, came to Galveston. Although the line of heavyweight champions begins in 1903, some historians believe that in fact the first heavyweight champion was Chinsky. But whatever the case, Joe was one of the strongest boxers of the time. Chinsky came to Galveston to give a master class to members of the local athletic club. That was the official story. But in fact, Chinsky came to hold a fight against the strongest representative of the club, Jack Johnson. I have already mentioned that official fights were outlawed in the USA at that time. They were legalized only in Nevada. In the rest of the states, fights were prohibited, so they were held in basements, closed gambling establishments, and even on barges. There was one loophole in the legislation that many people took advantage of. Master classes and demonstration fights were allowed, so professional fights were declared as demonstration fights. The main thing was that there were no police representatives around at that moment. It was not uncommon for fighters to be arrested immediately after a fight for participating in illegally organized professional fights, and promoters would then bail them out and pay fines. However, realizing the risks involved, promoters usually built the potential cost of fines into the cost of the fights. For Jack Johnson, the fight against Choyinski was officially just the 11th fight of his career, and for Choyinski himself, it was already his 74th fight. In the end, the rookie was knocked out in the 3rd round. However, after some time, one of the organizers of the evening claimed that Johnson was not told that the fight was real, not exhibition. But anyway, at the end of the fight, both boxers were arrested. Among the spectators was a plainclothes policeman, who quite rightly concluded that the fight was real and called his colleagues. Both boxers were sent to jail in the same cell. Together, they spent 23 days. During this time, Choyinski taught Johnson the basics of boxing, how the jab works, why are important feints, how to act in defense. As Johnson himself recalled later, Choyinski told him a phrase that Jack remembered for the rest of his life. A man who can move like you cannot miss punches at all. After they were released, Johnson left Galveston. It was the last fight in his hometown, and Jack could not even guess what path lay ahead of him. As for Choyinski, he'll still appear in our story in an unexpected role. First, Johnson travels to California, where in May 1902, his opponent is Jack Jeffries, the younger brother of reigning world super heavyweight champion James Jeffries. The Galveston giant knocked out his opponent in the 5th round, after which he carried him to the corner, handed him to the seconds, and then turned to his older brother sitting in ringside with the words, "You will be the same." The reigning champion was 4 centimeters taller than Johnson and 17 kilos heavier at the time. But even then, Jack realized that the key to success was not to be afraid of anyone. As soon as you let your guard down, you're going to get eaten. However, James Jeffries had the same philosophy as Johnson. Therefore, he did not even think of avenging his younger brother in the ring. Moreover, he stated that when there are no white contenders left at the top, I will end my career. Jack Johnson is a good fighter, but he is black, and for this reason, I will never fight him. If I wasn't the champion, I would face a but I won't give a chance to fight for the title. To all other champions, I advise you to follow this course. End quote. In February 1903, Jack Johnson had one title fight. You will ask how it is possible, because the title in those days was only one. Yes, popular opinion is that now there are a lot of titles, and before it was only one. But it's wrong. In the history of professional boxing, in fact, there is no period when the title of champion was only one. And even at the dawn of boxing in the late 19th and early 20th century, there were 2 championship titles. The first one was called the world title, and the second one was called the colored world title. It was Johnson who won the title of colored world champion in early 1903. So he became champion, and all the black champions of those years were generally satisfied with the result. It was impossible to fight white champions for the full title, so one can rejoice in such an accomplishment as well. But Johnson, unlike his colleagues of color, was confident that stepping over the white line was possible. He didn't yet understand how to do it, but he knew that fate would surely give him a chance if he kept winning and got the press talking about him. The next targets of Jack's were 3 strongest heavyweights of that time: Sam McVeigh, Georgie No, Langford. Johnson had 11 fights against them. McVeigh he defeated 3 times out of 3, Georgie No 5 times in 7 fights, and separately it is worth noting the victory over Sam Langford. This fighter is included in the Boxing Hall of Fame. One historian described Langford as follows: imagine James Toney with the punching power of Mike Tyson. Langford had 178 wins in his career, 126 of them early. In April 1904, after 3 wins over Sam McVeigh, the newspapers began to write that Johnson was the real challenger for the title held by Jeffries. The fact that some journalists demanded a Jeffries versus Johnson fight was not surprising, although it went against the conventions of those years. It was just that people who were primarily interested in the sport wanted to see a rising talent against a perennial champion who had some worthy challengers under his belt. Jack happened to meet Jeffries at a bar one day and asked, "When are you going to fight me?" Jeffries put $2,500 on the bar counter and replied, "I'll fight you in the basement of this establishment with no spectators, and if you can climb the stairs afterward, the money is yours." To this, Johnson replied, "I'm not a basement fighter," and the encounter went nowhere. But it wasn't the last one either. Meanwhile, in May 1905, Jeffries announced the end of his career. He stated that his last appearance in the ring would be as a referee. The fight would be between challenger Marvin Hart and the first official heavyweight champion, Jonathan Ruth. The winner of the fight will become the new super heavyweight champion of the world. But this fight has an interesting backstory. In March 1905, Marvin Hart faced Jack Johnson. As one of the journalists wrote after the fight, on the face of Johnson was not a single mark, but Hart's face was like mincemeat. However, the referee of that fight gave the victory to Hart. In those days, fights were most often decided by referees. Johnson in that fight, as in many, worked as a number two. The referee, explaining why he gave the victory to Hart, said if Hart did not go forward, the fight would not have happened. On the comments that Johnson threw significantly more punches, the referee noted that Hart withstood these punches, and therefore they were not so powerful. All in all, in that fight, Johnson was outright robbed, but he was increasingly recognized as the most serious contender for the title. They had to do something to dampen that talk. So the organizers of that fight decided to push Johnson aside with a referee robbery. As you can see, not much has changed in boxing since then. I wonder how they would have fared if Johnson had knocked out Hart. But Marvin held on, and 3 months later, in July 1905, he defeated Jack Ruth to become the new super heavyweight champion. But it was impossible to make Johnson vanish. Jack made a lot of noise, not only in the ring, but outside of it as well. As soon as he started making good money, he started dressing like the white rich. Luxurious suits, expensive shoes, ties, gold clip-on front teeth. He even bought a house in a rich neighborhood where white people lived. One day the police called him to the station for allegedly being late on a house payment. Everything was in order. When Johnson showed up at the station, it turned out that one of the residents of the neighborhood had filed a report with the police to have Johnson arrested because it was inappropriate for a black man to live in an upscale white neighborhood. Johnson's then manager asked him to move out of the neighborhood and not muddy the waters. Johnson fired him immediately. The story went public. Overnight, Jack Johnson became one of the most famous black people in the United States, and that went in favor of his career. Sometimes his fees reached up to $1,000, while the average annual income of a U.S. citizen at that time was about $500. This money Johnson spent on his uncompromising lifestyle. In particular, he actively used the services of girls of easy behavior. At the same time, he was not afraid to appear with them in public. Johnson's behavior evoked opposing feelings to each other. Blacks adored him because he was the black man who could. For the same reason, a fairly large segment of the white population hated him. It wondered the same thing as Samuel Jackson's character in Quentin Tarantino's movie Django Unchained. However, no matter how much they hated Johnson, his absolute self-confidence in the same size made people fear him. Plus, since Jack brought good money, promoters created him protection, for example, so that the police don't have to pick him up too much. But don't be misled by this wild lifestyle. Jack Johnson loved to read. He read hundreds of books in his lifetime. He had a great love of history. He studied in detail the lives of many historical famous personalities. He was interested in the latest achievements of technological progress. In particular, he loved cars and automobile racing, built his own garage workshop, where together with hired masters engaged in refining his cars. But most importantly, he knew his business well and was in excellent physical shape, which allowed him to win. In July 1907, an important event occurred in Johnson's career. Former world champion in 3 weights, including super heavyweight 44-year-old Bob Fitzsimons, attempted to resuscitate his career and decided that in order to do so, he had to defeat the one everyone was talking about, Jack Johnson. Unfortunately for Fitzsimons, he was unable to counter his opponent with anything and was knocked out in the second round. The importance of this event is that for the first time, a white super heavyweight champion lost to a black boxer. Yes, Fitzsimons was in former champion status, but still, at the time, the heavyweight champion was Canadian Tommy Burns, who had taken the title from Marvin Hart. Burns, unlike previous champions, did not directly state that he would not fight black. He said he was willing to make such a fight, but for $30,000. Such fees simply did not exist at that time. I will also remind you that at that time, the average American had to work for 2 years to earn $1,000. Burns was well aware that no one would pay him that kind of money. But all that math didn't faze Jack Johnson, and he started chasing Burns literally all over the world. He held a title defense in Los Angeles. Jack sits at ringside, comes to London. Johnson is there too. Burns flies to Paris. Johnson follows him. In August 1908, Burns goes to Australia to make several title defenses against local boxers. Guess who followed and challenged him at every corner? After Burns made 2 defenses in Australia, local businessman and promoter Hugh McIntosh made a statement that sent shivers down the spine of the boxing world. He said he was willing to pay Tommy Burns $30,000 to fight Jack Johnson. The reigning champion agreed and also demanded a share of the pay-per-views, in addition to the $30,000. So the actual fee was higher. Johnson was guaranteed $5,000. McIntosh wanted former champion Jeffries to referee the fight, but he asked for $5,000 for his services, plus travel and lodging. McIntosh turned down the former champion and decided he'd take over the refereeing duties. Imagine if Bob Arn or Don King had refereed the fight. When the contracts were signed, the first world champion in super heavyweight history, John Sullivan, was beyond furious. "Shame on Burns for ruining a good American precedent," Sullivan declared. Among those who arrived for the bout was the famous American writer Jack London. When asked who he'd root for, he said Burns, because he's white. Yes, I want to see a white man win. Ask Johnson, if he were watching a fight between a white man and a black man, who would he want to see win? The phrase of one of the Australian journalists became very popular in relation to this fight. It is a fight of white beauty against black unattractiveness. As you can understand, this confrontation went beyond the boundaries of sport. Former and current boxers made a great emphasis on racial confrontation, and they were confident that the upcoming fight would once again prove white supremacy. Burns also added fuel to the fire. He constantly told reporters, "I'll beat this or I'm not Tommy Burns." In addition, the title holder constantly called Johnson a coward. "All pussies," Burns said. However, despite the confidence of the champion and the public bookmakers, odds were not so clear. Burns was the favorite, but with a minimal advantage. Here it is worth noting that Tommy Burns until today is the shortest champion in the super heavyweight division. He was only 170 centimeters tall. Johnson was 14 centimeters taller and 12 kilograms heavier. The organizers understood that Jack was a real contender to win. If a black man beat a white man in front of a white crowd, trouble could happen. There were 20,000 spectators in the arena, with another 30,000 standing outside the arena to follow the fight by the reactions of those inside. Therefore, a large number of police officers were present in and around the stadium. The fight took place on December 26, 1908. When Jack Johnson was introduced in the ring, the audience shouted insults at him. Johnson was unperturbed. He bowed in all directions, and yet a smile never left his face. As the bell rang for the fight and the boxers drew closer, Johnson said to Burns, "It's me, Tommy, who told you I was a pussy." And seconds later, the challenger knocked the champion down. After that, Johnson got a hail of abuse from Tommy Burns' corner. Jack responded with a smile and punches. He was bigger than Burns, but more importantly, he was a better boxer. In addition, Johnson continued to taunt his opponent verbally. Most often he repeated, "Poor little Tommy, who told you that you are a boxer?" Poor little Tommy, who taught you to hit like that? You hit like a girl. What's the matter, Tommy? When Burns was already badly beaten, Johnson said, Tommy, you're as white as a flag. You're as white as a surrender flag. In themselves, these phrases could not be called a terrible insult. But when Johnson uttered those words, there was a mocking smile on his face. That's why the Galveston Giant is called the father of thrash talk. But interesting thrash talk, not stupid and offensive. Jack could have finished the fight in the first few rounds if he wanted to. But it wasn't just about beating Tommy Burns. He wanted to humiliate the white champion in front of the white audience, which was spewing torrents of insults at him. He talked to Burns and his audience at ringside and smiled constantly. He was on top of the world. He felt invincible and enjoyed literally every second of it. The fight was scheduled for 20 rounds. It was scheduled for 14. By that point, the champion was hopelessly outmatched. The challenger sends him to the floor. No, this is not a picture freeze. When the ambitions of the white race in the person of Tommy Burns were ready to collapse on the canvas, the police intervened and interrupted the recording of the fight, as well as stopped the fight itself. Immediately after the end of the writer, Jack London said, "It was not a fight, but a hopeless slaughter. It is now James Jeffrey's responsibility to return and wipe the golden smile off Jack Johnson's face. White men must be saved." This is what Jeffries himself responded to. Tommy Burns sold his pride, his white pride, for 30 grand. I get a lot of telegrams asking me to get back in the ring, but I've already done my last fight. As for the direct participants of the historic confrontation, Burns insisted that the fight was stopped too early. Johnson only grinned in response. It was the easiest fight of my life. I could have finished him sooner, but I wanted to punish him, and I got what I wanted. Remember, Burns said before the fight, "I'm gonna beat that or I ain't Tommy Burns." Ironically, he wasn't really Tommy Burns. It was an alias. His real name was Noah Brasso. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the title of champion was conditional. Not all champions carried this status during their years in the ring. Some were not awarded the title until years later. Championship titles were legalized in the early 1920s when boxing was legalized in all states, and the New York State Athletic Commission and the National Boxing Association took over. Sometime after the titles became official, historians began to turn back the clock. They tried to figure out where each division's championship streak began. In a super heavyweight division, they came to the conclusion that the starting point was John Sullivan, the most popular boxer of his time. He beat hundreds of competitors and was called the strongest. Then he was beaten by James Corbett. Now he's the strongest. Corbett was beaten by Fitzsimons, and Fitzsimons was beaten by Jeffries. The line was broken when Jeffries finished his career, but James ruled that the new champion would be decided by a fight between Hart and Ruth, and the line was restarted. Hart was then defeated by Burns. Burns beat Johnson. Thus was born the term lineal champion. Jack Johnson had no official title, simply because official titles didn't exist back then. He had a title according to the general perception of the public, the press, and the people who followed the boxing world. Simply put, people agreed among themselves that this is the strongest boxer. But back to the main topic. Johnson's championship was portrayed in the press as if something terrible had happened, like the world had collapsed. This is how one of the American newspapers reacted to the result of the fight. When later it became known about Johnson's predilection for white women, Jack became really tight. He had an affair with a white woman in Australia, and when he returned to the United States, he said, "The heartache of black women has made me give them up. From now on, I will only be involved with white women." The fact that the most famous black African American had relationships with white women was a real insult to white society. But to blacks, Johnson was a hero. For a white-dominated country, this is a bad thing. You can't allow disadvantaged people to see in front of them a brave and strong person of the same background as them, because pushing the limits of what is possible can be a motivator to destroy the current white-dominated social order. So the U.S. leadership did what it has always done. It began to manipulate public opinion with the help of the press. A very clever method was chosen for this purpose. The media began to criticize Johnson allegedly on behalf of the black population. Look, the newspaper said Johnson decided that people of his race were no match for him. Articles started appearing that blacks all over the country weren't happy, and unsuspecting black Americans suddenly find out from the newspapers that they're dissatisfied. And since the newspapers say we're dissatisfied, we must be dissatisfied. Immediately afterward, in his hometown of Galveston, the black community canceled a parade celebrating Johnson's arrival after winning the championship title. Still, Johnson was a world champion. However, nothing is impossible for an objective and incorruptible press. Out of nowhere, articles started coming out that Jack Johnson was not really a champion. The explanation was very simple. If James Jeffries finished his career as a champion and never lost in the boxing ring, then Marvin Hart, Tommy Burns, and Jack Johnson cannot call themselves champions. What did Jack do in this situation? Nothing new. He continued to act like he was king, like he was on top of the world, and no one was able to reach him. But no matter how much the press turned the public against the heavyweight champion, many people were genuinely interested in the figure of Jack Johnson. The man did what seemed impossible and continued to do so. He bought his mom a luxury home in Chicago. He bought himself new cars more often than most white Americans buy new shoes. What he was doing grabbed the attention of people all over the country. It was like Johnson went outside the system and created his own system and lived by his own rules. He delighted a huge number of people, regardless of color. In 1909, Jack had 4 fights, the most notable being the last one that year. The opponent was the world champion in the middleweight division, Stanley Ketchel. Among the heavyweights, white daredevils were not found, so the middleweight took over. Ketchel was almost 10 centimeters shorter and 16 kilos lighter than Johnson, 93 to 77. So in order to convince the public that Stanley had a chance for a picture together, he was given a special coat and heels. There was another thing. Johnson and Ketchel knew each other and repeatedly visited different entertainment establishments together. Johnson was uncomfortable hitting his buddy, so backstage he told Ketchel that he wouldn't try to beat him up or knock him out. Ketchel in turn promised that he would not use power attacks either. With those words, the boxers tried to go the whole distance without trying to knock each other out. It also made financial sense. The longer the fight, the longer the tape. The longer the tape, the more expensive it is to show, which means the boxers will make more money. That was the deal. It was basically an exhibition fight, but in reality, it was a little trickier. The organizers of the fight, knowing that Ketchel and Johnson agreed and were going to go the whole distance, decided to take a chance and agreed that at the end of the fight, Ketchel would be declared the winner and the new champion. There is no definite answer as to whether Stanley knew of this arrangement, but somehow Johnson found out about it. At first, Jack played with Ketchel like a child, sometimes picking Stanley up when his knees started to shake after another hit. In the 12th round, however, Johnson made a mistake. Jack tried to duck, and eventually he just put the back of his head under a punch and ended up on the floor. At this point, he decided it was time to end these games, or else he could be given a chance to put a plan to strip him of his championship title into action. Jack sent Ketchel not only to the knockout, but also to the dentist. He knocked Stanley out some teeth that were stuck in Johnson's glove. He can be seen shaking Ketchel's teeth off his gloves. Exactly 1 year after this fight, Ketchel's life would be cut short. He decided to seclude himself at the ranch to work on his physical fitness. To help, he hired a male ranch worker and a female cook who were a married couple. After a while, the two men decided to rob Ketchel. The man shot Stanley, and the woman went to the police and claimed that Ketchel had tried to rape her, so her spouse used a gun. However, she was confused in her testimony and finally confessed to everything and went to prison with her husband. Ketchel was only 24 years old. In 1990, he was among the first boxers inducted into the Boxing Hall of Fame. After the Ketchel fight, Johnson took a break and became an entertainer for vaudeville, a fairly popular entertainment in early 20th century America. Vaudeville was a mixture of different genres. Singers, dancers, humorists, animal trainers, and acrobats took turns on stage. Johnson, for the most part, demonstrated his outstanding physical data and showed a shadow fight. But sometimes he danced and even told jokes invented by himself. While Jack entertained the audience, and for an impressive $1,300 a month, the press attacked James Jeffries. The Chicago Tribune even created a Photoshop of those years. A little girl approaches James with the words, "Mr. Jeffries, you're going to fight Mr. Johnson, aren't you?" It was during that period of time that the term Great White Hope appeared in boxing. There have been several such boxers in boxing history. The most famous, and by far the most recent, on the list is Tommy Morrison. But the first was James Jeffries. Times of Great White Hope kept Jeffries busy on his beloved farm where he farmed alfalfa. In addition to the constant pressure from the press, he received hundreds of letters and telegrams weekly in which people pressed him to get back in the ring. Although the weight of the former champion exceeded 130 kilos and in fighting form, he weighed about 100 in the fall of 1909. James Jeffries, after a 5-year break, announced his return for one single fight against Jack Johnson. He accompanied this news with this comment, "I'm going into this fight for one reason, and one reason only, to prove that the white man is better than the Negro." On October 29, 1909, Johnson and Jeffries signed a contract to fight for the heavyweight championship of the world, and then put their agreement on the auction. Many promoters fought for the right to make this fight. The prize money offered by the promoters was to be split between the boxers, 75% to the winner, 25% to the loser. The biggest bid was $150,000, but the winning bid was $101,000, and it was made by a man named George Louis Rickard. In the boxing world, he is known as Tex Rickard, and many historians call him the greatest promoter in boxing history. Claiming to hold Johnson Jeffries, promoters provided only a written guarantee that they have such money, and Rickard put on the table at once the entire amount, and in gold. In addition, he gave Johnson's future wife a fur coat, and Jack himself handed a suitcase in which there were $25,100 bills. The figure of Tex Rickard is almost unknown to modern fans. However, it was this man who made a huge contribution to the development of professional boxing. He realized pretty quickly that from a boxing fight, not only can, but it is necessary to make an event that goes beyond just a sporting contest. And then it can bring just crazy money, and in the short term. The main thing is to find a highlight in the event, which will attract people and organize everything in such a way that people have a sense of exclusivity. Rickard made his fortune during the gold rush at the end of the 19th century, but then lost most of his money gambling. There's no point in describing in detail all his ups and downs in business. The most important thing is that in 1906, Tex organized a fight between the previously mentioned Joe Gans and Oscar Nelson. The fight brought income of $70,000. And then Rickard discovered a new kind of income. In 1925, Rickard invested $5 million in the construction of the arena Madison SQ Garden 3 generation, which existed until 1968. It was Tex Rickard who elevated the name IMAS G to iconic status. As for the current IMAS G arena, it is the 4th generation. In addition to this, Rickard founded the New York Rangers Hockey Club in 1926. When Rickard won the bidding for the Johnson-Jeffries fight, he immediately announced that he would build a special arena for the fight. For the first time in history, a championship fight was to take place in a stadium that was built exclusively for him. The date of the fight Rickard chose, the most pressing for all Americans. July 4th is Independence Day. It's hard to capture the essence of the situation, but imagine a white ex-champion coming back to take the title from a black man. And all this within a society where white supremacy reigns supreme. It takes place on Independence Day in a purpose-built stadium, and the sign for the fight is Fight of the Century. There was something else too. Tex Rickard was the first promoter to attach a price tag, date, and spectator seat number to the ticket, unlike before, when the spectator bought just an admission ticket without a seat. And the earlier you get to the arena, the better. To make sure everyone sat according to the seats they bought, Rickard hired special staff to oversee this. Thanks to this order, boxing fights became attractive to very rich people. Now, the rich could buy a ticket, and they did not need to arrive at the arena a few hours before the event to have time to take the coveted seat. Naturally, tickets at the ring could now be sold at a higher price. Tex Rickard invented the very exclusivity that rich people are willing to pay for. Always has been, and always will be. An event needed a scale never seen before. Rickard created it. He saw no limits to his ambition. He sent an offer to referee the fight to the current president of the United States, William Taft. When the presidential administration refused, the next candidate was author Arthur Conan Doyle, who gave the world Sherlock Holmes. This attempt was also a failure. Therefore, Rickard decided that the referee of the fight will be himself. Tex Rickard did not suffer from racial prejudice and did what would be best for business. He didn't care who won. But as he scaled up the event, more and more people were against the fight. The New York Times ran an article that said, if a black man wins, thousands of his illiterate brothers will misinterpret that victory as more than just physical superiority over their white neighbors. In addition to the press, the church got involved. Priests began to speak out en masse, not only against the fight, but against boxing in general. In other words, if whites don't win in this sport, it means it should be banned. Influential whites, businessmen, and the government feared that Johnson's success might trigger the collapse of a system where the white man was the pinnacle of evolution. And while the press had leverage to downplay Johnson's victory against Burns, in the case of Johnson's victory over Jeffries, the press simply had no leverage left. The fight was originally scheduled to take place in San Francisco, California, but the local governor, under pressure from the press and the church, announced a month before the event that he was banning the fight from taking place in the state. The arena was already finished and had to be dismantled. However, two cities in Nevada, Goldfix and Reno, expressed a desire to host the battle. Tex Rickard chose the second option because Reno had railroad tracks coming in from both the west and east. Before approving the fight, Nevada Governor Denver Dickerson summoned Rickard to his office. He wanted Rickard to assure him that the fight was not a setup. Since there had been rumors shortly before that Johnson had sold the fight, he would get a lot of money, and Jeffries would return the title to white people, and everyone would be left happy celebrating Independence Day. The point is that there were huge bets on this fight, and if it turned out that everything was planned in advance, the state would have gone bankrupt from lawsuits. The preparation for the fight was also interesting. Former super heavyweight champion Scorebet came to Jeffries' camp to help him with his training. I wanted Jeffries to win, not because Jack Johnson is a Negro, but because he's one of these new Negroes who think they're better than white people, Corbett stated. In the beginning, when I told you about Jack Johnson's acquaintance with Joe Choinski, I said he would appear in our story. So Choinski, with whom Johnson had a good relationship, volunteered to help, but not Jack, but his opponent. The entire boxing community believed in Jeffries, and anyone who could in any way become involved in the victory of the white people tried to be as close as possible to the savior. July 4th, 1910. The population of the city of Reno was only 11,000. On the day of the battle, there were about 30,000 people in the city. Those who arrived early spent the night in a hotel or rented room. Those who came later started in their own cars. Those who didn't have a car slept in bars and slept on tables. Because of the influx of the rich, crime increased. In just a couple days at the Reno jail, the number of criminals multiplied. The frenzy wasn't just in Reno, it was all over the country. To follow the fight, people gathered at the editorial offices of various publications, which received information from the scene by telegraph. San Francisco went even further. There, they organized something like a live broadcast. The organizers built a high ring and put 2 boxers, black and white, to imitate what was happening in the ring, again on the basis of telegraph messages from Reno. A few days before the fight, Jack Johnson started receiving anonymous threats. If he won, he would be shot. That's why Tex Rickard had police officers searching the spectators. If anyone had any weapons on them, they were confiscated. The arena was designed to hold 16,000 people, and those 16,000 were thrilled when James Jeffries refused to shake Jack Johnson's hand. The fight was scheduled for 45 rounds. That's 2 hours and 15 minutes of pure fight time, and 2.59 total length if you count the breaks. This, by the way, is one of the factors why many fights of those years are not so intense in terms of what is going on. A modern championship fight lasts 47 minutes, fight time plus breaks. Therefore, most boxers behave with restraint, trying to intelligently distribute their forces. Because instead of 47 minutes in the ring, a boxer has potentially 3 hours ahead of him. Plus, modern fights are held indoors at a comfortable temperature. While in the early days of boxing, many big fights were held during the day in open arenas under the scorching sun. Johnson skillfully used the clinch to suppress his opponent's attacks. In the first few rounds, he hardly thought about his own attacks. He realized that first, he had to assess his opponent's condition after almost 6 years out of boxing. James Corbett, who was outside the ring, started yelling at Johnson, "When are you going to start doing something?" Johnson replied to the former champion, "I fight like you fight, Mr. Corbett." Johnson was a follower of this approach, and it was the approach he demonstrated in the fight against Jeffries. He divided the fight into sections. In the first rounds, he simply suppressed his opponent's attacks. Then he began to attack at close range more often. When Jeffries got tired and slowed down, then Johnson started working his way towards him. Jeffries was heavier than his opponent, 103 pounds versus 94 pounds, but Johnson was faster and more cunning. The champion relied on his size, his power, which never let him down. The problem was that he had an opponent in front of him who understood very well how to neutralize his strengths. Of course, the 6 years Jeffries had spent out of the ring played a part, even considering he was only 35 years old. Meanwhile, James Corbett, who was in Jeffries' corner, forgot that he was a gentleman and began to literally hurl insults at Johnson. Jack just smiled back. He realized that he had the fight under control, and hysteria in the opponent's camp is an indicator of weakness. So as usual, he decided to add more oil to the fire. Johnson began to taunt his opponent. "How you doing, Jim? You all right? You like Jim? Sir Jeffries, give it your best shot. Do something, because the championship is at stake." After 14 rounds, Jeffries had a broken nose. There was blood on his face, on his chest, and even on his legs. In the 15th round, James Jeffries was knocked down for the first time in his career, despite the fact that it is forbidden by the rules. After 2 falls, Jeffries was helped to get up by a second and one of their journalists. After the 3rd fall, it was obvious that Jeffries did not want to continue. To save the honor of his boxer, the team intervened and stopped the fight, while promoter and referee Tex Rickard raised Johnson's hand. The audience left the arena in complete silence. Immediately after the fight, Jeffries made a comment that surprised many. "Johnson has been better this year than ever before. I wouldn't have been able to beat him even at my best. I just couldn't throw him an accurate punch." This is how the writer Jack London commented on the outcome of the fight. And here again, Johnson defeated the elected representative of the white race. But this time, it was the greatest representative of the white race. And for Johnson, it was like a game. The combination of a caveman and a giant grizzly could not intimidate the cold who turned out not to be a coward at all. Now, Jack Johnson was not just a world champion. His title was undeniable. He received recognition even from those who wished him defeat, from those who considered him a coward and a fake champion. As for the fees, they were among the highest in history, if we take relative values. Both boxers received $10,000 each as a signing bonus from the promoter, plus a share of the television rights. Jeffries received $66,666, Johnson $50,000 and $101,000 from Tex Rickard in the ratio of 75 to 25 in favor of the winner, and $25,000 plus a fur coat for Johnson's future wife. In the end, if you round it up, Jeffries got $100,000 and Johnson got $160,000 plus a fur coat for his future wife. The average annual income of a U.S. resident in 1910 was just under $600. The cost of the Ford Model T, which was gaining popularity, was $850. The Johnson-Jeffries fight took place in the afternoon, after which people could have moved on to the celebration of Independence Day. But instead, the country began riots, in some places turning into massacres. The black population rejoiced at Johnson's victory. That caused discontent among the white population. Clashes between the two races took place in 25 states. Violence swept the country. According to official figures, more than 20 people have been killed and several hundred injured. Unofficially, there are hundreds, maybe even thousands, and possibly tens of thousands of wounded, mostly among the black population. Some of the documented incidents are simply mind-boggling, especially considering that this took place in a country that called itself the leader of the democratic world and intended to instill democracy in others. In Houston, a black man was cheering Johnson's victory on a streetcar when a white man came up to him and stabbed him in the throat. In Georgia, a white man with a gun went to a construction site where blacks were working and opened fire, killing 3 construction workers. In New York, in Manhattan, a white mob set fire to a house where blacks lived, while the arsonist tried to block the doors so that none of the residents could escape. The number of victims of this shocking incident has not been officially reported, and this is only a small fraction of the documented incidents. In small towns across the country, there were crowds of black men lying in the middle of the street, with their heads shot through. The next day, on July 5th, 1910, the Los Angeles Times published an article entitled "A Word to the Black Man." It contained these words: "Don't get your nose too high, don't brag, don't let your ambition go the wrong way. Remember that you have done nothing. You're exactly the same members of society you were last week, and you don't deserve some new perception, and you won't get it. No person is going to think any better of you, because that winner in Reno is no different than you." End quote. In addition to this, the U.S. Congress decided to ban the demonstration of the fight Johnson-Jeffries. And former President Theodore Roosevelt, who himself boxed and loved this sport, wrote an article in which he called for a ban on boxing throughout the country. Immediately after his victory, Jack Johnson went to Chicago, where he was met by a crowd of people. She accompanied him to the house of his mother. During his address to the people, the undisputed super heavyweight champion said, "I hope that colored people all over the world will not be like the French. When Napoleon won battles, the French were for him. When he lost, they turned their backs on him. When I face my defeat, I want people to love less the same way they loved me when I was champion." That same night, a man with a gun tried to break into Johnson's mother's house, where Jack himself was staying. Fortunately, his attempt to break into the house was spotted by police officers on duty outside the house. When questioned, he claimed he wanted to kill Jack Johnson. There is speculation that the situation was staged to scare the inconvenient champion. Just a few days later, a New York newspaper ran the headline, "Jack Johnson should behave more modestly." But Johnson couldn't act humble. It was out of character. If he had been humble, he'd still be fighting on the backstretch for $5 to $10. But the problem was that the pressure on Johnson from the government and the press was mounting. His rambunctious lifestyle helped him withstand that pressure. The more pressure he was under, the more he partied, drank, and partied with white women. In November 1910, in the state of Maine, Johnson threatened to jump out of the window of his hotel room. After examination, the doctor diagnosed him with nervous exhaustion. Jack was advised to take a break from work and entertainment. If work he left aside, Entertainment did not. And although in public, the champion continued to smile at home, everything was different. His wife, Etta Duryea, felt the effects of Johnson's nervous breakdowns. Once, when they were not yet married, he beat Duryea after he suspected her of cheating. Etta was also held hostage to the situation. Having tied her fate to a black man, she could not break up with him because society would not accept her back. She rarely went out of the house because people on the street were pointing fingers at her and throwing hurtful words in her wake. In 1911, there was one very important moment that is rarely seen in the various biographies of Jack Johnson. As you may recall, previous champions who were white did not want to fight blacks. At the time, it was called drawing a white line. Blacks couldn't go beyond that white line. So Jack Johnson, in 1911, he drew the line too. You might think that now it was a black line, but no. As amazing as it sounds, it was still the same white line. Johnson's former black opponents, Georgie No, Sem Way, and current colored title holder Langford, quite rightly believed that if the undisputed champion's belt was now in the hands of a black boxer, he would give his brothers a chance. But it was not to be. Johnson refused to fight them, saying that the world was not interested in watching two black men fighting for the title, and Johnson had already beaten all three of them. Therefore, he felt that he was not obligated to do anything to these three again. Jack returned to the ring just 2 years later after defeating James Jeffries, July 4, 1912. His opponent was fireman Jim Flynn, who before the fight stated, "If I lose to this, you can shoot me." Over the course of the fight, Flynn regularly tried to headbutt Johnson. In the 9th round, when Johnson's advantage was clear, officials entered the ring. Ironically, one of them had a revolver, but nobody shot Jim Flynn. He was simply taken out of the fight, and Johnson was declared the winner. In 3 weeks after this fight, the U.S. Congress approved the law, according to which the record of the fight could be shown only in the territory of the state where it was filmed. It was forbidden to transport the tape to another state. The management of the sides were already reeling from the black champions' dominating victories. At this time, Johnson opened an establishment in Chicago called the Champions Cafe, which was open to everyone, regardless of color. Every weekend, this club was packed to capacity. Blacks partied with whites, without prejudice. One Chicago newspaper commented that Johnson, in his own way, was also helping to solve the race problem. What Johnson did showed that if people are not pitted against each other, they will not have any problems. That's all this country needs. A problem it doesn't want to solve is being solved by someone who's at the throat of the government. These are dark times for Jack Johnson. They began on September 11, 1912, when his wife Etta Duryea committed suicide. The relationship between Johnson and Duryea was not an easy one. Etta didn't realize what she was getting into. She knew her husband-to-be would be unfaithful from the start. Johnson's personal life was one of the American press's favorite subjects. The whole country knew who Johnson was with, when and where. Behind all his brutality and even majesty, she saw a man who, like everyone else, needed an island of happiness and silence. She wanted to be the closest person to him, a support and encouragement. But what she had certainly not expected was that her husband would become the central figure of the race war, and that this burden would begin to break her husband, and all this would result in nervous breakdowns, scandals, and even beatings. The final straw in all this was the death of her father. In her suicide note, Etta did not say a single bad word about her husband. On the contrary, she wrote, "Jack did everything he could to cure me, but it was useless. Ever since Daddy died, I've been driving myself to the grave." When Johnson saw his wife's body, he fainted. A few months after Etta Duryea's death, Johnson appeared in public with a girl named Lucy Cameron. But as soon as Jack appeared with Lucy in public in Chicago, came her mother and wrote a statement to the police, accusing Jack Johnson of kidnapping her daughter. Out of nowhere, the press got wind of it. Here, the woman is already giving interviews and says, "Jack Johnson has hypnotic powers, and he is using my little girl. I'd rather my daughter spend her life in a mental institution than with a And then we go back a couple of years to 1910, when a law called the White Slave Trade Act was passed in the United States. Abbreviated Mann's Law, named in honor of its author, Congressman James Robert Mann. As it was stated, this initiative was aimed at combating the mass forced prostitution of white girls. The law stated that transporting a woman or girl for prostitution or lewdness or for any other immoral purpose was a criminal offense, punishable by imprisonment. Mann and the supporters of this law were actively convincing the public that the migrants who were coming into the country were enticing naive American girls into prostitution, and something had to be done about it immediately. The problem was that the growth of prostitution was not related to migrants, but to the system that operated in the country, where women were paid less than men for the same work, and women had far fewer areas for employment than men. While working in a brothel brought a very substantial income, not to mention private escort work. In reality, neither the problem nor the real cause bothered James Mann. He didn't care about white women. If he really wanted to make life better for women, he could have initiated an equal pay bill. But James Mann was concerned about race, and his legislation sought to further enforce the line separating blacks and whites. The cherry on the cake of this law was the very language, transportation for any other immoral purpose. What that other immoral purpose was not explained, and it meant that if a white woman decided to have a relationship with a black man, and they traveled together, out of state, the man would be arrested. And if the police felt that the girl was not cooperating sufficiently with the investigation, she too would go to jail. Naturally, in such a situation, any girl to avoid punishment will assure that she entered into a relationship with a black man, not of her own free will. So in fact, the law was aimed at ensuring that neither blacks nor whites would even think of reducing the social distance. That's the law that the government tried to trap Jack Johnson on. That's why they gave a platform to Lucy Cameron's mother, to spin the story of transportation for any other immoral purpose. The scale was so large that the case was sent to George Wickersham, U.S. Attorney General and head of the Justice Department. When Wickersham saw the case, he called it a mockery and a caricature. Yet despite his recommendation to stop this travesty of justice, District Attorney James Wilkerson took the case to trial. Incidentally, it was Wilkerson who would sentence Al Capone to 11 years in prison as a judge in 1931. On October 18, 1912, Jack Johnson was arrested for violating the Mann Act. Jack was out on bail, and a few days later, the prosecution pressured the Chicago mayor to revoke Jack Johnson's cafe license. The mayor had no chance to resist, and he took the cafe license away from the champion. It was not only whites who were against Johnson, but also part of the black population. One of the first fighters for black rights, Booker T. Washington, made a speech that a man with money uses it to harm his own people. I do not approve of Jack Johnson's actions. A man with muscles but no brain is a useless creature. It should be noted that at that time, the black society was divided into two parts. Booker T. Washington led the part that did not protest racial segregation. Booker T. believed that first the black community of the United States should be educated and become skilled workers, and then try to merge with white citizens. The other part was led by William Du Bois, who was an opponent of Booker T. Washington's ideas, and demanded that social equality be established right now. By the way, Du Bois visited the Soviet Union several times, and in the 40s even wrote a series of articles in which he, on the one hand, condemned the American-hating communism, and on the other hand, he said that in the Union, there is no such racial and class inequality as in the United States. Du Bois was convinced that the cause of the black population's woes was American capitalism. That is why, in search of a solution to the problem, he visited countries that were very different from the states in their structure. In addition to the USSR, Du Bois traveled to Germany when Adolf Hitler was in power. Du Bois traveled to the East as well. He first visited Japan and then traveled to China, where he met with the founder and first leader of the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong. So Jack Johnson was more in favor of Du Bois' ideas. So Booker T. Washington simply used the situation in which Johnson found himself to present his ideas in a better light than the ideas that Du Bois was proposing. But the result of all this was that a large number of the black population turned away from Jack Johnson. As for Du Bois, he supported Johnson, saying that as a full member of society, he had the right to choose who he wanted to be in a relationship with. Hen Johnson's trial began. The unexpected happened. Lucy Cameron said that Jack had not forced her to commit immoral acts. Moreover, she said that she loved Johnson and wanted to marry him. The prosecution expected Lucy to testify against Johnson, because otherwise there was a chance of going to prison with Johnson. But Lucy took a tough and uncompromising stand without any fear, and no one expected that from her. In addition, the prosecution had no evidence that she had crossed the state line accompanied by Johnson. Lucy, in turn, argued that she crossed the state line alone. The case fell apart. However, the state and federal government were not about to back down. An entire squad of agents was formed to follow Johnson to record the moment when he would cross the state line with a white woman. In addition to surveillance, the agents interrogated anyone who had anything to do with Johnson, including even former sparring partners. The government was looking for any lead to indict the champion. Johnson commented, "White hopes failed, and those offended by my becoming a champion decided that if they couldn't get me one way, they would do it another." On November 7, 1912, just 3 weeks after his first arrest, Jack Johnson was arrested again. The girl, Belle Schneiber, with whom Jack had a relationship in 1909 and 1910, testified against the champion. She stated that in August 1910, she had an affair with Johnson, and in October of that year, she traveled with him from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to Chicago, Illinois. Based on this, Jack Johnson was indicted for transporting the woman for any other immoral purpose. Johnson did not deny his relationship with Belle Schneiber in 1909 and 1910, but he claimed that the relationship took place at a time when the law was not yet in place. Or, as they say, the law does not apply retroactively. But Belle Schreiber claimed that they made the trip in the fall of 1910, already during the period of the law. But Belle Schreiber claimed that they had made the trip in the fall of 1910, already during the period of the law. It came to light years later that the police had simply pounced on Belle Schneiber, threatening her that if she didn't say what needed to be said, she would go to jail. After his arrest, Johnson spent a week in jail before he was able to make bail. It took time to prepare for the final hearing. While the trial was underway, on December 4, 1912, Johnson married Lucy Cameron, exactly 1 month before the U.S. presidential election was held. During the campaign, a man named Woodrow Wilson declared that after his election, black people in the United States would finally get justice. Moreover, during the struggle for votes, Wilson attracted William Du Bois to his side. Wilson won the election and was scheduled to take office on March 4, 1912. Johnson's trial was scheduled for May 7th. Jack had his chance, but Woodrow Wilson's promises of a new reality for the black population of the United States turned out to be nothing more than campaign lies. As soon as Woodrow Wilson took office as president, he immediately increased discrimination against black employees. In government departments, black employees were segregated from white employees. Now, they began to work in separate rooms. They had their own canteen and their own toilet. After a while, the situation reached the point of absurdity. It was simply not profitable to keep separate rooms for black employees, and they were fired, and no one was going to hire new black employees. Jack Johnson believed in his heart that he had a chance for a fair trial, but with his head, He realized that if a racist was at the helm of the country, there was little chance. Nevertheless, on May 7, 1913, he appeared at the trial entitled The United States versus Jack Arthur Johnson. The main witness, Belle Schreiber, stated that she was with Jack Johnson not for love, but for financial compensation, and that he drove her from state to state for immoral purposes. 2.5 hours later, the jury found Johnson guilty of violating the Mann Act. Less than a month after the final hearing, the court decided on a sentence. It sentenced Johnson to 1 year and 1 day in prison. The reigning champion was not arrested because he had the right to appeal, which he did. However, Johnson didn't do it to try to get justice. He knew he had no chance of a fair trial, so he decided to escape, and the appeal was just to buy some time. But getting out of town wasn't easy. It was possible to do it by car, because Johnson was the only black man in town with a car, and there were agents on duty at the railroad stations. Johnson was helped by the manager of one of the black baseball clubs. In June 20th, the club was on a playing tour of the Northeast. Johnson was dressed in the branded clothes of the club, thanks to which, at the train station, he disappeared into a group of more than 30 black athletes. There was another detail, however, that was revealed by Jack Johnson's mother. She stated that her son's undercover escape was only possible because he had paid several bribes to officials, including the judge who was sentencing him. In this way, Johnson showed that racial hatred could be dampened slightly with $1. On June 25th, Jack, along with his wife Lucy, was spotted in Montreal, Canada. From there, he traveled to France. Upon his arrival in Paris, Johnson expressed his intentions to fight in Russia. One of his friends was Frederick Blues Thomas, better known as Fedor Fedorovich Thomas. Like Johnson, he was born in the United States to a family of former slaves. His father was killed by a white neighbor over a land dispute. Afterward, Thomas set out to travel the country. Looking at the flourishing racism in 1874, he went to London and a year later ended up in Paris, where he worked as a waiter in restaurants. Thomas was lucky enough to work in one of the most prestigious establishments in Paris, the Maxim restaurant. There he met a Russian nobleman who suggested that he move to Moscow, and the future Fyodor Fyodorovich agreed. He moved to Russia in 1899. Being familiar with the French entertainment industry, Thomas was in demand. His contribution allowed the Moscow Aquarium Garden to become one of the most popular entertainment venues in Moscow. In 1912 in Moscow, Thomas opened his own restaurant called Maxim. It was located at 17 Bolshaya Dimitrovka Street. The restaurant instantly became popular, and Fyodor Fyodorovich Thomas became one of the richest residents of Russia. At some point, his fortune, if translated into dollars, exceeded 1 million. Boxing in the Russian Empire already existed. The first section of boxing was created in 1887 in St. Petersburg. The first amateur tournament was held there in 1913, but still this sport did not have a scale, and Thomas wanted to organize a fight in Moscow with the participation of the champion in the super heavyweight. While Thomas was thinking about how to do all this, Johnson had problems in Europe. Hotels refused to provide him with accommodation. In London, musical performers refused to go on stage if it turned out that among the audience, Jack Johnson. But the main problem was not that the public was not ready to accept a black fugitive, but that Johnson was running out of money. In December 1913, in one of the Parisian cabarets, Johnson met with his namesake Jim Johnson. It was the first ever super heavyweight title fight between two black boxers. In June 1914, Johnson's second fight took place in France. The opponent was American Frank Moran. The fight lasted all the planned 20 rounds, during which time Johnson played his opponent. It is suspected that Johnson delayed the fight on purpose because he had a share of the fight. And the price for the show, as you remember, depended on the length of the tape itself. 2 weeks after this fight, in the middle of July 1914, Jack Johnson went to Moscow to meet his friend, Fedor Fedorovich Thomas. Thomas's idea was to organize a championship fight between Jack and his longtime rival, Sem McVeigh. Everyone loved the idea. a fight for the most important title in world boxing between two black boxers in Moscow. By the way, at that time, Moscow was not the capital. The capital was St. Petersburg. Johnson could have made $35,000 plus the proceeds from the taped fight. Sam McVeigh would finally get the long-awaited title fight, and the Moscow public would witness an incredibly exotic spectacle. After negotiations with all interested parties, everything was ready to proceed to the organization of this event. But a few weeks earlier in Paris, Jack Johnson had his hand raised in token of his victory over Frank Morin. The hands of the clock had gone past midnight, and the calendar showed June 28, 1914. On this day, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated in the city of Sarajevo. That led to the July crisis, after which World War I began on July 28, 1914. The ambitious plans of Thomas and Johnson in Russia came to an end. The only safe part of the globe for Jack Johnson was Latin America. In January 1914 in Buenos Aires, Argentina, Johnson fights a non-title fight against Jack Murrea, after which he received an offer to defend his championship belt against a new great white hope. And that hope was big indeed. He was 199 tall, weighing in at nearly 110 pounds. 33-year-old Jess Willard had only been in the professional ring for 4 years, but already had a reputation as a man who could kill an opponent with one punch. In 1913, in the third fight against Bill Young, Willard sent his opponent to the canvas with an accurate punch. Young died without regaining consciousness. Since Johnson couldn't travel to the States, the venue was Havana. This was done with the expectation that the American spectators were not far to get to the site of the event. In total, about 15,000 people traveled to the Cuba capital from the States. The fight took place on April 5th, 1914. The undisputed favorite was Jack Johnson. However, in recent years, the regularity of his appearances in the ring left much to be desired. 5 fights in 5 years, plus all the constant wandering around the world and long periods without training, did not go in vain. Preparing for the fight against Willard, he was doing at best half of the work he needed to do. Johnson came into the fight weighing 102 kg, 7 kg more than his optimal fighting weight. As for Willard, Jess was preparing for the fight of a lifetime. The bout was scheduled for 45 rounds. The beginning confirmed that in terms of experience and technical preparation, Johnson is a head above his opponent. But during the fight in Havana was hot. The temperature approached 35 degrees. Johnson tries to knock out his opponent all 8 rounds and gives it all he has. Willard is split. Willard is all red. Willard is battered. Willard doesn't take a step forward. He just lets everything go. After round 8, Johnson's stamina, which has always been excellent, starts to drain. Like sand, somewhere in the middle rounds, around 15 now, Willard goes at his opponent. Willard uses his size, strength, and stamina to push Johnson all over the ring. Before the start of round 26, Jack Johnson says to his second, "Tell my wife I'm tired and get her out of the arena." Johnson already knew that today, 22:91, is the last day of his championship. In round 26, Willard sends the champion to the canvas with a hard right jab. Johnson could have gotten up, but he knew he had lost this fight, and he didn't lose it now. Jack Johnson lost this fight 2 years before it even took place. And you're about to see why. And here's what the New York Times said about the fight. Willard restored white supremacy in the fistfight. The Ethiopian has been destroyed. There will never again be a black champion in boxing if the present generation holds out. End quote. Johnson stated that he gave up the fight, but based on the way he attacked the challenger early on, and the fact that he spent 26 rounds in the ring in terrible heat, no one believed him. Neither did Jess Willard, who said that if he had given up the fight, he could have done it early. It was hot as hell in there. There's also a theory that Jack Johnson made a deal that he would lose to Willard and the leadership would overturn his prison sentence and drop the charges. There is no even circumstantial confirmation of this theory. After his loss to Willard, Johnson sent in paperwork to get a new passport to return to the United States. After losing the title, he traveled to London, where he became a vaudeville performer. But after punching his theater manager in the face, he was ordered to leave the country. In early 1916, World War I was still going on in Europe. So Johnson went to Spain, which took a neutral stance and officially took no part in the war. In fact, it was providing humanitarian aid to Britain and France. Therefore, it was still partly a party to the conflict. The country itself was calm. On April 6, 1917, the United States announced its entry into the First World War, and Johnson tried to enlist as a volunteer, expecting that for this, he would get a prison sentence. The former champion was turned down by the State Justice Department. Johnson moved to Mexico, where he continued to hold fights. But since the fight against Willard, his biggest fee was $2,000. Remember that for the fight with Willard, he received $30,000, and the biggest fee in his career was $160,000. At first, Johnson claimed that in Mexico is better than in the United States, but it was self-deception. Jack Johnson traveled the world chasing a championship belt, and then traveled it again, running away from prosecution. He was just tired of wandering. On July 20th, 1920, Jack Johnson arrived in Tijuana, where he crossed the Mexico-U.S. border. Accompanied by federal agents, he boarded a train bound for Leavenworth, Kansas, where he was to serve his sentence. Upon arrival in Leavenworth, Jack said he would drive the car. He was allowed to. Typical Jack Johnson. He had a smile on his face as he drove. No, not because he was going to prison, but because he was coming home. I've come to realize that one of my biggest mistakes was moving to Europe. When I was a fugitive, nothing came into my life to compensate for the sadness I felt at being separated from friends and family. Now, do you understand why he lost to Jess Willard long before this fight ever took place? Johnson spent over 2 months out of prison before he began serving his sentence. He began serving his sentence on September 30th, 1920. When Jack arrived at the prison, he saw a familiar face. The warden was Denver Dickinson, governor of Nevada when Johnson fought Jeffries, the same Dickinson who got Tex Rickards to convince him that the fight was fair. It was Dickinson who made Johnson in charge of physical training. He allowed Jack to spar, full sparring, and in front of an audience, despite the fact that Johnson sometimes violated the regime. For example, could sleep when it was necessary to go to breakfast. He was released 2.5 months ahead of schedule, July 9th, 1921. There was a crowd waiting for him on the way out. He returned to the ring almost 2 years later, in 1923. The goal was a world title fight. But with him being 45 years old, everyone realized that Jack was trying to jump over his head. He had his last fight on April 28, 1931, at the age of 53. In 1924, he separated from Lucy Cameron, and in 1925, he remarried. He met his third wife, as well as his first, at a motor race. His third wife, Irene Pinot, was with him for the rest of his life. After his career ended, Johnson made occasional appearances in Wadeville, running a nightclub, trying to become a preacher, and of course, holding exhibition bouts. During this time, he got into politics when he supported President Franklin Roosevelt when he was up for re-election. Jack Johnson loved cars and fast driving. Back in the days when he lived in Chicago, he once drove to another city. The police pulled him over for speeding. "How much did Jack Johnson ask me?" $50, said the cop. Johnson handed him a $100 bill and said no change, because I would be driving back the same way. Whether this is true or another Jack Johnson story is unknown, but it is very likely true, because it was his style. Johnson lived his whole life pushing the gas pedal to the limit, literally and figuratively, until his last day. June 10, 1946, Jack Johnson was returning home with his friend after a small tour of Texas, where he participated in fairs, handing out autographed cards and talking to boxing fans. Johnson stopped for lunch at a roadside cafe. When the food arrived, they were told to move to the far corner or leave the establishment. Johnson and his friend moved because they were hungry, but when Jack got into the car after lunch, he was furious. According to the friend, Johnson was driving at about 110 kilometers per hour. At some point, he lost control and crashed into a pole. The passenger got away with bruises. Johnson received severe injuries, from which he died several hours later in the hospital. He was 68 years old. Tens of thousands of people gathered in Chicago to see the champion off. Jack Johnson was buried next to his first wife, Etta Doria. At first, there was a large stone on the grave, without any inscriptions. Then the family name appeared on it. In 2005, 2 small stones were placed next to the large stone. One says Etta, Johnson's loving wife, and the other says Jack Johnson, the first black super heavyweight champion. Johnson set a record that is unlikely to be broken. He is the first boxer to fight in 5 different decades. From 1890 to the 1930s, only one man has ever repeated the feat: Roberto Duran. In 2016, several congressmen petitioned President Barack Obama to pardon Jack Johnson. The point was for the President of the United States to recognize that Johnson was wrongfully accused and sent to prison. And guess what? Obama refused to pardon Jack Johnson without explanation. In 2018, one man decided to follow through and still clear Jack Johnson's name. He approached the President of the United States. Then it was already Donald Trump with a new attempt. And this time, the Galveston giant was acquitted, and all charges against him were found to be unfounded, and his prison sentence was overturned. The man who finally managed to get Johnson's name cleared is named Sylvester Stallone. Recall that in 2010, Sylvester was inducted into the Boxing Hall of Fame for his significant contribution to professional boxing. Essentially, the decision to cancel no longer changes anything, but it's still an important tribute to arguably the most colorful personality in boxing history. The Galveston giant has set a bar that no one has been able to reach yet.
Jack Johnson was a big inspiration because of what he did out of the ring. He was so bold. Jack Johnson was a black man back when white people lynched on weekends, every weekend. Back in 1909, they would send him letters saying, "You fighting a white man? If you knock him out, we'll kill you." He said, "Just kill my black buggers, I'm gonna knock this white man cold." And Jack Johnson, he's bad. He had to be a bad, bad black man. Wasn't no black Muslims to defend him. Wasn't no NAACP in 1909. Wasn't no Rap Brown. Wasn't no MOVE. All these black groups. Wasn't no Angela Davis, no Hill Newton, no Malcolm X. He was by himself. He would dress up in pretty suits. Allowed dress up them days. He put on pretty white neckties and pretty white, and had white women. You know that nigga was bold. He married white women. You would get lynched for looking at a white woman in them days. That man married white women. He was bad. Back in 1909, man. Man, you know, Jack Johnson was the greatest. He had to be the greatest of all. Wasn't no Black Panthers, wasn't no bodyguards. White people lynching niggas. Wasn't no television, wasn't no telephone. He was doing all this stuff in them days. He was bad when you think about it. I know I'm bad, but he was crazy.
There's some monks in the past, they put people like me in check. They put our egos in check. I don't put myself in the league of Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson's fighting in the ring, and there's 75,000 people saying, "I'm gonna kill you." You heard him. Oh, and he's beating the guy. Boom, boom, boom. Oh, he's so beautiful. I'm gonna send him to you real nice. Boom, boom. And he's talking to the guy's wife. "How you doing, Miss Jeffries?" "Hey, John L. Sullivan, Mr. Sullivan, how you doing, sir?" And then boom, 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 beat the guy that. And watch when you see, if you ever watch him fight, he's looking at the crowd. He's always smiling because they're cursing at him like a dog. Wow. You're gonna get lynched. I talk that shit, the baddest man on the planet, the greatest fighter God created, and then I look in the history books and I say, "Oh fuck, I'm just talking, nigga."